Here are some things that will help you get started and also keep going. The first thing to think about is to know yourself as a writer. What kind of writer are you? Are you someone who needs to have an outline to get started? Or are you someone who needs to just free write and get words on paper and find out what you're going to talk about through that? The second thing that you need to do is to start earlier than planned. Almost everybody waits too long. If you wait until you're sure you know what you're going to say, you're going to be quite disappointed, because as soon as you start writing, it's going to change anyway. So it helps to start early and get those ideas on paper and develop them as you're writing. The third thing that you need to do is to make a schedule and stick with it. There are two kinds of writing schedules that you can have. One is what we call binge writing, where you spend a lot of time writing, maybe 2 or 3 days focusing on doing what you're doing, many hours each day. And that's a really good way to start a project, because you become immersed into the idea, you understand the literature, you get into a rhythm. But it's not very sustainable. To be sustainable, you need to have what we call snack writing, to write a little bit every day, or at least every other day. A good rule of thumb is an hour a day of writing. It doesn't sound like very much, but it's probably a lot more than what you're doing right now, and it certainly adds up over the course of weeks and months. The fourth thing that helps you to get started and keep going is to realize that you can start anywhere. There's no reason why you have to start with the very first sentence and go on to the second and then on to the third. You can start anywhere in your paper. Many people start writing their methods section, for example, because that's the section that they know the best. And then they move on to describing their analysis, and then maybe they write the introduction last. It doesn't matter, you just start somewhere and start getting words on paper. The fifth thing is to not get in your own way. A lot of people ruin whatever creative flow they have by stopping before they've used up that creative flow and interrupting themselves. For example, they might be writing down something and have an idea, and halfway through the idea they stop and think, oh, I need to get a reference on this. So they stop writing and they get up and they try to find the reference, and then they've forgotten why they needed the reference, and they've forgotten what it was they were going to say. So if you first are in flow, if you first start having those ideas, make sure you just get them all on paper before you then go back and start fixing them. Writing is a two-part process. Part of it is very creative, where you're just trying to figure out what it is you want to say, and part of it is quite critical, where you structure and make it for somebody else. And it's almost impossible to do those things at once, at the same time. How is it you find your voice as a writer? There's several ways you can go about doing this. The first one is to realize that when it comes to academic writing, there are a lot of conventions, but there are very few rules. A lot of people think that there's a lot of rules and it's very stringent, but if you look around and pay attention to all the academic writing that's out there, you'll see there are a lot of ways to do it. So you probably have a lot more flexibility than you realize. One thing to think about is your geolinguistic context. In an Anglo-Saxon style of writing, for example, the burden of clarity is on the writer. If you write something and it's unclear, it's your job to go back and fix it so that the reader understands what you're trying to say. If you come from a more continental tradition, for example, it's much more accepted to have tangents, to have complex argumentation, and to have threads that don't necessarily get picked up, because this is meant to challenge the reader, to get them to think about things. Another tradition, which you'll see many places in the area, sort of discourages an individualistic style of writing and tries to put forth an argumentation that represents a school of thought. And this makes it very difficult sometimes to hear the individual writer's voice in that argumentation. Even within these different traditions, you'll find that there are some variations. For example, in the Anglo-Saxon style, there's quite a big difference between American and British style of writing. American is a little bit more informal, and some might say a little bit more bombastic, say things with a little bit more confidence. Whereas the UK style is a little bit more cautious and a little bit more formal. You'll also notice within disciplines there are different ways of writing. There are different ways of accepting, for example, how you talk about yourself and your own research. In some disciplines it's perfectly acceptable to say I. In other disciplines it's not. In some disciplines not only is it okay to say I, but you need to step back and reflect very actively on your own positionality in your research. And other disciplines and methods that would be completely unheard of to talk about yourself being so involved in your own research. One thing you can do is simply to read a lot. By reading a lot, both within your discipline and within your field of study, but also in other disciplines and other fields of study, you get a real sense of what is acceptable, what kind of conventions are out there, but not only that, how much room for flexibility you actually have. And finally, the most important thing you can do is to simply write a lot. Rewrite and find your own voice in your own writing. The most important thing to think about when it comes to feedback is how important it is. There's something called the knowledge curse or the curse of knowledge, and what that basically means is the more you know about something, the harder it is to explain to somebody else. If you think about something you know really well, even as simple as walking, for example, how you start to explain it to somebody who doesn't know how to do it, you almost don't know where to start because it seems so obvious to you. And this is what happens with researchers. The more they get into their research, the more they understand their own research, the more difficult it is to take that step back and to know, where should I start explaining? What can I assume is obvious and what can I assume needs to be talked about? It's almost impossible for you to know and to make these choices without somebody coming in there and saying, this part needs to be explained more and this part you've explained 5 times already. The other thing that happens with a knowledge curse is that what you've actually written very seldom resembles what you actually had in your head. So a lot of times you will look at something that you've written and you'll think, well, yes, this is exactly what I meant to say, but you're not actually reading the words. You're just looking at words that remind you of what you tried to say, which is not the same thing as reading what you actually wrote. So having somebody else look at it can help pull you out of that and see the difference between what it is you thought you were writing and what it is you actually wrote. Everybody needs this kind of feedback. In fact, the better writer you are, the more important this is, because the more invested you are in your writing and the more difficult it is to see. You even become literally blind to your own typos after a certain point where you simply cannot see that a word is missing or repeated or spelled wrong. There are a lot of different kinds of feedback you can get. You can get feedback early in the process, you can get it later in the process, you can get it from somebody talking to you, you can get it from written comments. You can have a formal conversation with somebody or a formal written feedback, or you can have informal feedback. You can get feedback from a writing expert like a copy editor who will talk about your language. You can get feedback from, for example, a supervisor who's talking about your method or talking about your research. You can have feedback from a colleague who's just simply talking about whether or not this is interesting to you or interesting to them. With all these different types of feedback, it's very much up to you to decide what kind of feedback you're ready for at any given time and what kind of feedback will really help you. One type of feedback that I find to be particularly useful at an early stage of writing is what I call the good conversation. And this is when you work with a colleague of yours or somebody who at least you can meet with and talk to. And this is about talking about your work on a very basic level rather than commenting on specific sentences or your writing as writing. This is more about the ideas that are in the writing. And it helps to talk about your writing in a general way before they even read the draft. For example, explaining to them why you're interested in this in the first place or what you found most exciting about this work so far. It's a good way to get them into your head so they can also see what it is you find exciting or intriguing about this particular work. When they start reading your work, make sure that you tell them to be thinking about the larger things. What is the question? What is the answer? What is the main argument you have in the paper? Rather than focusing on details like grammar or spelling. And when you get a chance to sit down and talk with them, what's nice about having it as a conversation rather than written is that they can ask you questions, things that they felt unsure about. It makes it easier to handle criticism when people ask you a question and say, I'm sorry, but can you explain what you meant right here, rather than getting a written comment back that just has a circle and says unclear. The most formal kind of feedback you can get is the peer review you get back from journals. Now this feedback, because it matters so much in terms of whether or not your work gets published, you need to spend some time thinking about it before you react. It helps to read it through and then maybe wait a week or two before you decide what you're going to do with it. You don't have to do everything the peer reviewers tell you, and you might find indeed that some of them are disagreeing with each other or giving you somewhat mixed messages about what it is they want you to do. Take a step back and think to yourself, what of all this feedback is going to help make my paper better? Because you need to own the feedback. You need to feel like this is your paper and the feedback is supposed to help you make it better. When you submit your paper back to the journal again, make sure that you send with it a revision memo where you've explained precisely what you've done with each comment the reviewers have given you. When you write a revision memo back to the journal, when you resubmit, you need to go through each of the comments the reviewers gave you and explain what it is you did. You can agree with the comment and say, this is what I did, see page 3, paragraph 2, or you can agree with the essence of the comment, but say, yes, I understand why you wanted me to take into account this piece of literature, for example, but I thought it was a little bit of a tangent and I'm already over my word limit, so I decided not to add that, but I do understand why you wanted me to do that. Or you can actually outright disagree with a comment, but make sure that you explain why. You can say, for example, reviewer 3 wanted me to add this section on this and this, but this is completely irrelevant for my work, so I've gone back to the introduction and made it much more clear what time period I'm covering so that this is no longer an issue. The important thing about doing this is, again, making sure that the paper is yours, that you own it, and you take responsibility for all of the revisions that you make. My name is Lyn Nygaard. For the last 30 years, I've been working with academics in a lot of different fields and a lot of different disciplines, working on getting an idea from their heads onto paper and to submitting. Right now, I'm based at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, where I help writers in a lot of different ways. I help them with basic motivation by arranging retreats, intensive writing days, writing courses. I give them direct feedback on their work, and I also give them more general advice on how to publish and how to think of themselves as writers. As an academic, I'm focusing on issues around research productivity. That is why some scholars produce a lot and other scholars not so much. What is it they actually struggle with, and what are the differences between different kinds of scholars? I look at demographic things, for example, why there seems to be a gender gap in productivity, but also geolinguistic differences, why some language groups publish more than others, and also how we count research productivity, how we measure it. My name is Lyn Nygaard, and I'm based at PRIO, the Peace Research Institute Oslo in Norway. The main reasons I wrote Writing for Scholars was based on my experience as being a copy editor. Usually I was called in because somebody was writing English as a second language and they felt like they needed help with the language. So I would look at their work and try to work with the language, but I couldn't get very far before I started asking larger questions like, what is it you're actually trying to say? Who's going to be reading this thing? What's going to happen to it? Is this a journal article? Is it a book chapter? I'm not even sure what this is. Even very simple grammatical changes, you can't really make them until you know a little bit more about what's happening. And so over the years I began to gather up these observations and these questions that I had as an editor, and I put them together in a workshop. I started giving the workshop quite regularly, and as I got more and more observations through the workshop, I put it together and made a book out of it for Writing for Scholars, where I've put together all of these things I have observed. In the second edition, I also brought in voices from other authors, because the first edition was pretty much based entirely on my own experiences as an editor. But in the revised version now, I've also brought in ideas from other writers as well on writing. The audience for Writing for Scholars is primarily younger scholars who are just starting to write for journals or publication based on their own research. But it can also be used by more experienced scholars to hone their own work, or even to help them structure the kind of advice that they want to give to their students. Writing for Scholars is mainly targeted at new scholars who are publishing their work for the first time in journals. Writing for Scholars is written to be accessible and understandable for people who are doing this for the very first time and might find it intimidating. It tries to break it down step by step and see it as less threatening. Writing for Scholars is also useful for more mature scholars who have been writing for a long time but haven't really thought about what it is they actually do. Writing for Scholars puts a lot of words on what they understand tacitly about their writing, but haven't really thought about explicitly and how they go about doing it. A third group that might use Writing for Scholars are those more experienced scholars who are working with younger ones, who are quite sure how to explain something they know how to do, but haven't really tried to break it down step by step and explain to someone who's younger than they are.